Shall I start?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Regarding the 2 previous days, there have been some technical problems. Therefore, the lectures couldn't take place. The organization apologizes and we'll go on today with the teachings regarding with death and the process of dying. That's you.
다 가장 다고름 부채게 치외 신이 감바 생긴 텔라 되네 담식도 마소는 숨전도와 다 손에 섹스 우네 각과 각스 르는 로이 남은 유르 송아래 대인데 네 담식 제원디 페나 다키 손에 세세들 먼저 마이나도 통을 차를 까봐 롱게 넘버 셰프 대당 링직도 소롱데 죽용이여 그래 소롱 주바당 되네 램지 되네 단윈데 주야라 자베 롱주 이나 부제 바렘바 렘바체네 타 다와 고당 원내 체친다고 대샤고 주의나가 되는 롱근이 바 조네 되는 나조 실제기
The section of the text that we're going through speaks about death and the process of dying. And to begin with, the author, Gampopa, tells the reader that the practitioner needs, in order to understand the process of death and dying, to acquaint himself with the various signs of death and dying in the context of birth, aging, sickness and death. There are in particular 3 things that the practitioner needs to contemplate. To begin with, he needs to consider how the present life came to be. And the fact that even from the very beginning, that is to say at conception or following upon conception, there is a process of decline which eventually, well, to begin with, of course, there is a process of growth, and then after birth, a process of decline sets in, a process of decline which will end in death. Now, at conception, what happens is that the mind stream of the deceased individual enters the womb of the future mother in consequence of there being a karmic connection between that mind stream and the 2 parents. And once the mind stream has entered the womb of the future mother, the so-called life prana or life force starts operating. The life prana, which at conception accompanies the mind stream that enters the womb of the future mother. Now, once conception has occurred, to begin with, there is just the mind stream and the life prana at hand. However, gradually, during the development of the fetus in the womb of the mother, prior to birth, all other pranas will gradually or progressively develop. In that, the other pranas extend outwards from the life prana, the life force, being the origin of all of them. And to begin with, there are the 10 root pranas that extend outwards from the life prana. And once the 10 root pranas become operational, then all the other branch pranas extend outwards progressively throughout the period in the womb. And the process of all pranas coming to be or developing is a period of 9 months and 10 days. And once this has occurred, birth will happen. Birth as we know it takes place.
So ni said, so said, that penna, so gloom tetan, tea tend to chua, that so gloom the nature, Naranzo never to search your what, till I make it say, said your re. The net said the net to be la, so long, leg under so long the chair, going to sunum the chair.
Leg under the so lay sunum.
Lay sunum, neither the net so long said the sort to be.
So we can see that in terms of the so-called life prana or life force, it is, as it were, the mother of all other pranas. The other pranas that then extend outwards from it. One may then wonder what it is that keeps the life force, the life prana, operational, or what is it that sustains it throughout a lifespan, beginning with conception and ending with death? Well, there are primarily 2 factors responsible for sustaining the so-called life prana or life force, thus also maintaining the other pranas needed for a person to keep alive, or for a sentient being to be or to keep alive. Namely, the 2 factors, actions and the karma these actions have accrued. So here we're looking at the karma that previous actions have accrued, and merit, that is to say, meritorious mindset, meritorious lifestyle, and the like. It's primarily these 2. Karma accrued by previous actions and merit that sustain the life prana of a specific life span. This is what primarily, these two factors are, I should say, primarily what keep a sentient being alive.
대체인데 뺀나 단다 가르슈 레당 쓰는 미데 세인드 다 속게 레당 절바진 소롱데 유한보 내면도 왜 된 세세스가 된대지서.
Now once the karma associated with a specific lifespan, the karma which maintains that lifespan and merit are exhausted, death happens. When both the karma which keeps the being alive and the merit that also keeps the being alive come to an end in terms of a specific lifespan, then death happens, because the life prana or the life force of that lifespan ceases therefore to be operational. Because of the two factors for its maintenance have come to an end.
So the sedu condition segiosana umenga se thing.
That brings us to the next sign or indication in terms of death, namely the gradual decline of both outer respiration and inner respiration.
De semje mangche kaldan de tayang over gijinge jin den wangsang xie dao chuna ta di ugramba gatang gramba de takil gagrama to ramba di no tugyo.
Now, in terms of natural death, as it were, in the context of death and dying, in terms of so-called natural death, namely, there isn't a sudden circumstance which causes premature death or sudden death. There is rather perhaps an outdrawn illness and so on. Then what was just explained applies in terms of both outer and inner respirations gradually decreasing and at the end finally stop, spelling death. Now that gradual ceasing of inner and outer respirations do not apply in terms of sudden death caused by accidental or sudden circumstances. Then what happens is that both the phases of inner and outer respirations stop suddenly.
The minutes on there, Tangan so much on there, then young that good soap chimbu, long tongue, sling jig the long the remji gaviore.
She do so your
Marita, Jenny. Loju Jutsane, Long Jigge, Ranjapper, Nangba and Gane,
Now, if we go back to birth, as was explained, once the life force and all the pranas extending outwards from it have developed and birth has happened, next a process of decline sets in, where every 10 years one of the 10 root pranas weakens throughout that 10-year period. One of the root pranas weakens, a process of decline sets in, and at the end of approximately 10 years, then the root prana in question has declined to the point where it can no longer function on its own. Therefore, it's absorbed by one or many of the pranas, the branch pranas associated with it, and can thus continue to function, but with a diminished capacity. So every 10 years this happens, and at the end of all those periods, all those 10-year periods, what is left is just the life prana, the life force prana.
Tapana Latin Kansa, so chim long tenzo, lo jutsam in the button gane, Tama, then Gayan to that, Shilla Yeve Gaba, then that round the Ludenzo, Gen, Jomatenzo, Thomas Guyum, roll jurs on the road can they charge.
Next, Gampopa explains what happens then. There is just the life force or the life prana left. There is only a residue, as it were, of the other pranas. They are no longer operational or functional, which means that the individual is close to death as we know it. However, as the life force or the life prana is still at hand, or for as long as it is at hand, death is prevented. But in consequence of all other pranas having declined, what happens is that the building blocks of the physical body and the various functions of the mind are greatly weakened, in consequence of which a process of decline sets in with respect to the elements. If you remember, in a previous session, there were explanations about the 4 elements, earth, water, air and fire, and that of what one may perhaps in English refer to as empty space, and the fact that these elements are synonymous with the psychophysical constituents of a sentient being. And here, now, as death is close by or quite imminent, what happens is that a process of decline sets in with respect to the functions and capacities of those elements. And here, excuse me, I forgot to say, what Gampopa mentions in his Jewel Ornament here is that therefore the body, the physical body, to the onlooker, takes on the appearance of a corpse. So the appearance of the individual as to the physical body and his mental capacities, there is a change, drastic change happening.
An number of jurors said the condition Jurguyadasana, Joy Jinane, Rakshu the side country, Thomas side company, but say we.
So, as was said, the 10 root pranas and all other pranas associated with them gradually decrease throughout an individual's lifespan, and that having happened indicates imminent death. Imminent death in terms of the process where the elements decline begins. Now, the most coarse of the first of the 5 elements is the one named Earth.
That's the good young two, and the good thought of the Shitatan.
In terms of this process of decline, as to the element named Earth, there are various signs which indicates that this decline is happening. The signs or indications are divided into outer and inner. Now, outer indications are perceptible to an onlooker, but not the inner. The inner indications are known by the dying person alone. We will start with the outer signs of the element named Earth declining at the time of death. The dying person will try to move his body upwards. Let's say he is lying down on a bed. That's usually the case at this point. And the dying person will try to move himself upwards towards the headrest of the bed, and the glow of his complexion decreases, and the dying person becomes more and more pale, as it were. These are some of the outer signs indicating the decline or the process of decline that has set in regarding the element Earth.
신노긴 미 코란기 통화들라 제 마사로 통화라고지 코란 묘사들
Koramas Sado.
양의 티슈바 마 홍로 통화 샤르데스 때롱스의 가르세기와레스 전지송한테 상으로 살 팀로와 세지 지난 송도와
Now, in terms of the inner sign or possible signs, that is to say, what does the dying person, him or herself, experience at this point? Well, it's what one may call a sinking feeling. The dying person, as the earth element gradually comes to its end, feels as if he's falling downwards.
대간한 신게 딱 디제트가 정말 추이 컴되게 뉘바트 사용비어래.
Next, the water element gradually stops functioning.
되네 다들은 시다는 다 이용비어래. 시다도 되네 다디 카탄 하단 늦어 깜부 차이 그래. zubuti kambu rawachi chayu doa.
Some of the signs of this happening is that the mucous membranes of the dying person, one can see that they start drying up, the lips become dry. So does the mucous membranes within the orifices of the nose and so on. That indicates that the water element gradually stops functioning.
Tene nontaku tene chi migjundaru tuandaru homa chalres.
Migjusena duvara bore yamina chetan chikla.
Chetan chikla nima potong shik chundaru den ro homa ngod wa tendra.
Experience-wise, that is to say, the inner sign or signs experienced by the dying person is comparable to that of an optical illusion, like a mirage in the desert, where due to atmospheric conditions, there is the optical illusion of water. There may also be the experiencing of something quite similar, the optical illusion of mist, rather. So that's what the dying person experiences as the water element declines and finally comes to an end.
Tene ta joan may come together nupate sayundu delayan shitata ta ni yongde kyose.
And next, the element fire declines gradually, and here there are again both outer and inner indications of that happening.
Ashitatu luge megi chan te
Country.
luge mechane kongbala sokone rem je te do yung.
One of the outer indications is that the body's warmth gradually ceases starting with the feet and then gradually moving upward, meaning the body loses its previous temperature, the natural temperature the body has throughout life. It becomes cold. And experience-wise, as to the dying person, sparks of fire are sensed. The presence of sparks of fire are sensed.
시다도 가르쳐 주세나 나에 long-term 차 제버리 나와는데 차데 되네 나이 람데 차는 나데 그난도 롱데 칼에 가운데 좀 되네 미 종샤 취리 라진 감스데 미티 다서지래 때대선도 미감비선데 차요 시다.
Then next the air element starts dissolving, indicated by three things in terms of outer indications, the main outer indications, namely that the ear structure caves in and the ears sags, and the nose structure also starts collapsing and the nose appears crooked to the onlooker. And in terms of the gaze of the person, the dying person seems to be staring at a fixed point somewhere. The eyes no longer move here and there. And in terms of the dying person's experience, the inner indication as it were, the dying person feels like being blown about in the wind, aimlessly and without control. And at the end of this segment of decline, it becomes more and more difficult for the person to continue to breathe, and finally breathing stops. In terms of breathing in and out. So outer respiration stops. This was then a brief explanation about the different phases of decline, spelling death, in the context of the four elements: earth, water, fire and air. Now, in terms of a Buddhist practitioner in this period of decline, a Buddhist practitioner who previously, during his life, has devoted his time to the two main practices, meditation practices, as to the path of the Buddhist Tantras. The practice, which is about various stages of generating what one may term an enlightened world, and training the mind in that regard to the point where the effect is that the practitioner is no longer trapped in attachments and aversions with respect to the worldly world, as it were. By way of this practice, the practitioner has overcome those attachments and aversions. And then there is the second principal type of meditation as to the path of the Buddhist Tantras, called stages of completion, which is about the Buddhist practitioner having also trained in so-called enlightening or illuminating knowledge, which sees the true nature of the worldly world as well as the true nature of the enlightened world, thus making for a mindset which at this point, when these processes of decline set in at the time of death, the practitioner is so well trained in both types of meditation that he applies those, and is therefore there isn't a negative impact on him in terms of the process of death and dying. Med Kangla Kamsa, Jonne, de Sheshiva Madre. De la Gachen Jan Yöna Yang, Tim Rindi Yong Yöpa Michel.
Temrum what's you? That Temrum got the shame, Hena, the Lamsan to near to women, you heard and made. You are my 2,000 stand-ups and get their chair.
Home to soon Shava Nansin Tanda, they shaken la Kobo window. Tim Lingpa, more shaken. Koran ran talking.
Yeah, what that room to motion, Tarsina the room to motion.
Larry,
that and a tire machine chair. Send the concha towards a year of a chair.
Oh, concha towards.
Yeah, that Tana consumed you a chair. Tene, yin a young. Ta jing da ji nasa da wo de ji lamsan chi gi yue ta ma che din do na tan de ne che wa yin ba ga ran train to che ta
shi gi me de rang gi ngo ma che ba yin na
rang de ta ma che ba ji na
ta ma che ba ji ne
ta na ta na ji xie sam sam da won du xie yue de
oh da re ba
yu kin ji
re ba yu kin
ta de pa xie de ne yong wen tem tem du xia yu de dong me ga chi re de Xing Jin ba.
Det Xing Jin ba yin tanda gi nyam len pa gi rikti Koran o she mi lu ba so ge lu.
Ya, ta xue mi du a, de le rewa jin jar de ge yo ro ba.
Re.
Ta di tin de de sam ma dang che, che zu mam jin yang len de sam ma dang na.
Re ba yi chu la sam lo ma tang ma
che, che zu ni ge shuo le sam ma dang ne. De ne mam jin yang len nang na. De ne
Jatan Namasona Khenpo. Netes Kogin, Lukare is not that. Reva Gyapkingi read the race of Winova. Tini, that Korareva the Gyamne de Gerva. That Reva Gyapshimpa Tanga Kitso Ginyam and Chain Gona Shake Ereko.
Tankarese, the get under cheek the shake your one.
No.
Mato Shino, the Jezo Naming, meeting day and shake your Marawa. Cheek the shade, Jezo Nam Yamnikana, Tansam Yunkin, Yina. Time, Joy. Temrim the town the Shandia, I'm a situation some
Gampo Revashi to Tene Yang da Denderang Maris da Shianin Samsung Motre.
Motre name, then it's a number
So what was just explained is with respect to someone who has achieved perfection or a very high level of skill as to these two meditations during his lifetime. That sort of person, in consequence of his achievements or his realization, will not be negatively impacted by death and the process of dying. Then you have another type of practitioner who may have engaged in these types of meditation to quite some extent, but who hasn't yet arrived at a level which permits him to go through this process so that he is not negatively impacted. So this type of person, though well trained, will perhaps, if we take the example of a person dying of a disease, the person dying of a disease, though well trained, may not recognize when the process of decline as to the four elements that was just explained starts. He may still have hopes of recovery, thinking, well, perhaps I'll make it after all, which evidently would point to that though well trained or having trained to some extent, the person has not yet remedied attachments to this life and the like. However, it may come to pass, as this process of decline continues and becomes more evident, that he becomes aware of that recovery isn't a possibility. That as to recovery, he's beyond hope. At that point, this practitioner should try to set his mind in the practice of these two types of meditation. Then you have the kind of practitioner who has, to a very slight extent or not at all, engaged in the practice of the path of the Buddhist Tantras, but who has engaged in the practices of Mahayana Buddhism, the path of a bodhisattva. And this practitioner, at the time of death, in terms of the process of death and dying, as was described, should at that point recollect and focus on the various instructions of mind training.
다 단다 진짜게 람바숨테 무추네 냠다 시이 템름 깔려양 반나 제조 다신 처마서도 휴마거래 바도 동번은 선장고요래 조금은 제조고요래 되네 대간한 팅게 제조 강삼 그만지 냠네 용기지나 바도 딱 남기 템름 된저 제텔라 되네 제유에서 샤르도 모처 타르와 톱로비어래 되네 다 성주 쌤들 맘지냐는 연기 된저 있나 양 되네 바도네 뭐네 동니기 따와 된저 제 강한 또네 상제도 성주 쌤배 종신 대화 진다 소파당 가든게 내가 소파리체 Lar semjinge ton podu me pardutu le somyore.
So, in terms of what happens at the end of the process of death and dying, as to these three types of practitioner, in terms of the first of the three, at the end, there is the attaining of the Dharmakaya, the final goal, that of Buddha, the enlightened state. In terms of the second type of practitioner, that individual will, in the phase between death and a new rebirth, the very beginning of that phase, due to being well trained, there is the possibility of him recognizing mind's true nature, that of so-called illuminating or enlightening knowledge, which is now cleared of, unoccupied by the workings of the worldly mind, and therefore the practitioner attaining so-called liberation, which is one of the levels of enlightenment prior to final enlightenment, i.e., there is liberation from rebirth in worldly existences. Then there is the third type of practitioner who primarily during his life has focused upon the path of a bodhisattva, cultivating the so-called Bodhi mind to a great extent, with the result of, at this point, recognizing or giving rise to a higher level of knowledge of emptiness, in consequence of which, Daddy Tongi Tavala Tene so in consequence of both a higher level of knowledge of emptiness and having generated the Bodhi mind to a great extent, this individual will be able to take rebirth in what is popularly known as a pure land. Examples, Devachen, Tushita, and other such realms. And those individuals will go through the remaining levels of the path of enlightenment and attain Buddha the enlightened state, at which point they will then return to various impure world systems, and because of their previous aspirations to benefit others, benefit innumerable sentient beings. Now, these three categories of practitioners are practitioners who, in consequence of having dedicated their lives to the practices they did, are able to handle death and dying, so that in all three cases there is a very good outcome. In Tibet, this kind of practitioner was referred to as the kind of practitioner who is able to manage his own outcome, so that the outcome is a good one from the perspective of the path of enlightenment.
Rangla Tepashukchim Shivuyovice, then young Nambe Chödrak Lobjon Tesam Bevice, then said Lee Tendo Tepatan, then Lamata Yedam Lava Soam with the banking, then Sonam was a Saya Consatenzo, then the party Temrim Cancer. Joint Temrim is already more machine Nayang. Did that you do till I come to the so at ne? Then it she Temrim the Charsal, Nang Temrim. Okay.
You waiting when the more machine Nayang.
Yeah, you do so at that they will conchachi or
Dig it sablata. So what have Tugna?
Tugna? Then Lama Yedam Tuje. Then Pardo Tombu Yeshen Moshene. Then
Lame Tugje Latene.
Lame Tuje, Yedam Tuje then. Then Diggins
De Latene.
Della tenne Pardo Tombu Yeshe Moshe
Moshe Batsa.
Moshe. Then della tengens in ne. That Shaposum ye to Tartarini Nedoa. Then he get the young to be jiggy.
Did you Tarpa? Regular Tarpa.
Yeah, they were changing us of Pache.
Then you have a fourth kind of practitioner. The practitioner who, throughout his lifetime, has had a great capacity for devotion, trust and confidence in the Buddha's teaching, in the teacher, in the Yidam, and so on. However, this practitioner may be lacking formal Buddhist education. It's not the type of practitioner who by way of engaging in Buddhist studies, have a good knowledge of, for example, the details of the processes as to death and dying that were explained. However, this kind of practitioner has, throughout his life, dedicated himself primarily to the practices of trust and confidence, as well as that of focusing one-pointedly with trust and confidence in the Lama, the Yidam, and so on. It's also the kind of practitioner who, to some extent, has engaged in meritorious deeds. Now, because of a more limited background, as it were, in terms of Buddhist education, perhaps, there might be other circumstances contributing to that as well, contributing to that this kind of practitioner doesn't recognize what happens as the elements start the process of decline in the context of death and dying. However, the practitioner may be aware of that his life is now nearing its end and will therefore, by force of habit, pray to the Lama, the Yidam, focusing on that one-pointedly, with the great force of his trust and confidence in them. And that condition, together with or conjoining with the compassion and spiritual influence of the Lama and the Yidam, the two seen as inseparable, will have the following effect, namely, once the process of death and dying has come to its end and the mind stream of the deceased person enters the very first phase of the period between death and a new rebirth, right then and there, by way of these two conditions or circumstances, the practitioner recognizes mind's true nature and is able to place his mind in its true nature at that point and remain in that so-called samadhi, that stable meditation state, which may last for 3-4 days, in some cases an entire week, even 2 weeks, at the end of which the mind stream of that practitioner takes rebirth in a Pure Land, Devachen or otherwise.
Yang Rijik
Also?
Rani Kunjosum Japson Che, the Tebatambo Yukiche, send the church has been Yamni, Jeju Machona. Chuni Jitamang, some 600 Lama Chike. Poem Mingama Tene. Tene Taubishinda, Rap Taubishinda, Jet to a Chitan. 대다른 마종 나양 밀리 최딩시라 네버 제트비.
Then you have yet another type of practitioner who, throughout his life, hasn't been able to dedicate himself much to the practice of the Buddhist path. However, the practitioner in question is someone who has a firm and stable trust and confidence in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Now, this type of practitioner who hasn't been able to do much practice during his or her life, though this person has great devotion for the three objects of refuge. In the context of what was just described, the process of death and dying, if this person has the merit to him or herself in advance perhaps, or by a fellow practitioner or someone near and dear, arranging at the time of death, just prior to death, with a spiritual guide who has a realization of Dharmata, mind's true nature, that this spiritual guide performs the specific practice which has to do with guiding the mind stream of the deceased individual so that a good outcome can happen. If there is that good circumstance for this happening, namely that kind of spiritual guide performing the practice where the deceased individual is guided through this process, and after death, the good outcome would be either that this person is able, providing the person has that kind of merit, he takes rebirth in a Pure Land. If that kind of merit isn't at hand on behalf of the deceased person, then there is the second possibility of the realized spiritual guide guiding him so that a so-called free and well-favored human rebirth is obtained, namely the rebirth of a human being who will reconnect with the path to enlightenment and therefore in his next rebirth, and therefore be able to continue with efforts on the path to enlightenment.
딱 대단한 면나야. 딱 런이 남바 마이나야. 되네 원내 전에 춘이 담바 신킨 라마지게 매당 둔로 가리나 기나양 포엠밍아 게네 직낭베이나 밀당 라이 류지 때는 포토고요.
Chirtamirtangi.
제담베당 미유지당.
That is Nangpa Mayina Nicha.
Nika. Adi nane to Lucante Chilim, Quaram Chidan, Minaya, Sambasang in Yorwa. Tundoinaya, Sambasang in Yorwa, Sambasang Rikin, Java Tumbo, Java Sango, Tindel Potu Son. Then military.
There is the kind of practitioner where what was just explained isn't applicable, as well as human beings in general, even animals. Human beings who are not Buddhists, and animals evidently not being Buddhists. Now, a spiritual guide with the kind of realization just explained would be able, by way of the same kind of practice, which is primarily about guiding the mind stream of the deceased person to good circumstances, be able to do so. So that at least a human rebirth is obtained. Even though it may not be about a so-called free and well-favored human rebirth, at least it's about a human rebirth, or a rebirth as a so-called divine individual, which concerns types of existences that are higher than those of human beings. And that's possible in terms of a realized spiritual guide bringing this about. That's possible both in terms of human beings at large and animals. Whether the rebirth in question will be a rebirth of very good circumstances, or a regular rebirth, or a bit worse, as a human being, for example, that depends upon the predispositions of the individual. A person or an individual of a kind mindset, a compassionate mindset, will obtain, with the help of the efforts of the realized spiritual guide, will obtain a rebirth either as a human being or as a divine being in very good circumstances. Whereas a deceased person who isn't of that kind of a good disposition, as it were, may obtain a rebirth as a regular human being who has reasonable circumstances, and someone who is of an even lesser good disposition, mind-wise, as it were, will, with the help of this kind of spiritual guide, be able to take rebirth as a human being, but perhaps the circumstances won't be the best.
I can take it in some marriage in a young. To enrich Shigyonanda, Miss Shigyonanda, Rani Nambayina, T. Nalam to Sanje the Sonsim gets in drop.
She drog in the Nangbayina.
She broke in the Nangbai men.
Ray in Duncan.
The kid that Nangbai men, the Sanje Sonsim in La Diam.
Then a Minna, chick song tip and the rest.
Minna said, she came the Nangbai Minna.
Nangbayina.
Then that Chile to one Nangbachiana, Sanje the Sonsim gets in the Dradavina. Take what you was on the Yalishi, which you pingy or Perna.
Then there is human beings and animals at large. Now, if a Buddhist practitioner is in contact with a person or an animal who is in the grip of death and dying, but the person isn't a Buddhist, and with respect to animals as well, it will be very beneficial for the person, for the sentient being, whether a regular human being or an animal, to hear the names of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas recited. So a Buddhist practitioner doing that, finding himself in the presence of a human being or an animal, in the grip of death and dying, it is advised that the Buddhist practitioner recites the names of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, so that the person, the dying individual, hears those names. That's very beneficial for the dying individual in terms of obtaining a good rebirth. Even an animal hearing those names will be impacted to the extent where, if the animal hears, for example, the name of the Buddha of our era, Shakyatupa, then that will perhaps propel the individual into a good rebirth, or that will have that effect. The recitation will have that effect. In consequence of the fact that by merely hearing that name pronounced, negative predispositions in the mind stream will be remedied to some extent. Now, in terms of the world at large today, death is to most individuals synonymous with, or happens. Death happens when a person breathes his last. That's sort of the general definition of death. Which, according to Buddhism, spells the end of so-called outer respiration and processes associated with it. So, even though outer respiration has ended, namely breathing in and out, according to Buddhism, the physical body is not yet dead. There is what Buddhism calls inner respiration and its processes, which will continue for as long as the mind remains in the body. that is to say, till the mind exits the physical body. And that doesn't happen when regular breathing stops. Inner respiration and its processes continue, and therefore the body isn't yet dead.
She temple Joma Tatu, Teni Jetsune, Tigle, Garchate, Manu to Pabiare, Te Padu, that Koran, Delacheta, Nanta, that Kalwami, how much shall you?
Now, so outer respiration has ceased. Next, the so-called white element obtained from the Father descends from its seat at the crown of the head down to the so-called heart center, located in the center of the torso. And that happening, here you have no outer indications that can be observed by an onlooker. There is simply just the so-called inner indication or sign of this happening experienced by the dying person, who at this point senses an impression of just an opaque, milky presence.
Tene, di jetla, tebe wone, tene, malatobe, come marchate, kado maru, tene, masa te, yungrutsam te ya done, ninkala, kam karchatan, reungiore.
Next, the red element from the mother ascends from its seat in the body, which is a bit below the navel, to the heart center. And the dying person, when this occurs, senses an impression of a reddish presence. Now, it appears that size-wise, these two elements are no larger than a tiny mustard seed. And so the two, the white and the red elements, meet, as it were, at the heart center.
And
in terms of the dying person, the experience is as if heaven and earth collapses on top of each other. And a regular sentient being, not at all trained or not well trained in terms of the Buddhist path, falls in consequence of this into an unconscious state of mind.
Yata kata vu, tene sartung songjuk, tene
riktang
på det ni panikan di ngoshe broa. Somebody ne pache shegi yusare. Songju semdang, tene lame mingal tene lama da yedam te pa yodik. Tensu te degen tene sartung songjuk te semde ngoshe.
Now, on the other hand, the first two categories of practitioners described earlier, the two higher levels, of practitioner, or rather the two categories of practitioners who are on higher levels of training. At this point, these practitioners, as well as many of the practitioners of the third category, those who have a firm and stable trust and confidence in the Lama and the Yidam, and who have generated the body-mind to a great extent during their lives. These three kinds of practitioner at this point will not fall into an unconscious state because of the kind of training they've done throughout their lives. They have more or less been able to be aware of, conscious of, the various stages in terms of the process of death and dying, knowing that they are in the grip of death and dying, and they have focused on mind's true nature or devotion for the Lama and the Yidam and the like, which at this point have the effect of them, instead of falling into an unconscious state, they sense a clear presence, much like a clear and cloudless autumn sky, by way of their capacity for illuminating knowledge which is cleared of, unoccupied by the workings of the worldly mind. Thus, either enlightenment itself, final enlightenment, or liberation at some level of enlightenment prior to final enlightenment will result.
단다 두서이 여바래 최신이 감고 윤센 두서이 여듀 감들라 두서 토라마 땅을 채네 다이 시지모 시대는 양도 최신인데 지 감바지 나나 땅아저 버라지 사시다요.
Now, right now, all of us are in a situation where we have time. Many may feel they don't. However, if one thoroughly thinks through one's situation, one can always make time by way of choice for devoting the major part of one's life to the practices needed for a good outcome. Namely, that at the time of the process of death and dying, one will therefore have the chance, as it were, because of having devoted time to training, such as contemplating death in the various ways described previously. There might be the chance of recognizing and to fully or to some extent at the time of death realizing so-called illuminating or enlightening knowledge. It's very important to not waste the time one has, which would make that possible.
간저 라 찬스도 마송나 바도 짠에 되고 셀링이 때도 상계를 담아야 간저리 요아래.
There are even instructions in Buddhism that permit an individual to attain final enlightenment prior to death, which means that death and dying is no longer an issue. One will never again be in the grip of this process that has been described in brief. However, whether that occurs depends upon the individual and his capacity for making the efforts required, the efforts that could result in this.
Tene, daga nanshingi yinla rewa yemigwa, pardo nanga so rewa toptuwe jike, chansi dama sona sumwa.
Känner rewa yemigwa? Det där penna lama chiki pove med Then you have the kind of practitioner also described earlier, who, even though he hasn't attained enlightenment during his lifetime, he has trained to the extent where he doesn't have to depend on anyone's assistance at the time of death and dying in terms of a good outcome.
Daga nanshingi jin zangula tenne yang chik milula sopa top tuwe rap agushin je tuwe dring milu chöding pamayang milu ji je tuwe.
Det känns som på latin, det kan vi känna.
Jen lame poa dawar tenne
Assistance, ja.
agushin je tuwe. Tenne
Jag menar kema sampo.
ja
Milu
ja
ringchen.
milu rinchen.
Vad så?
Daga nanshingi rangi lama tepa yidam tepa tenne agushin dang tetar menayang milu chöding je tuwe. Tene ta tende jimne na yang penna ta sanje ge chen tang ge cham bo sa ba tenne milu sang bo je tuya la so de la chance mo bu yo.
There are other possibilities, perhaps not with a final outcome in terms of freeing oneself from a continuous process of rebirth. However, with the assistance of others, such as a realized spiritual guide, engaging in practices using specific instructions whereby the deceased individual is guided to rebirth in a pure land or a free and well-favored human rebirth. That's another possibility. Yet another one is with reference to the kind of practitioner with a firm and stable trust and confidence in the Lama and the Yida, who then also, by the same kind of assistance, may take rebirth in a so-called pure land or obtain a free and well-favored human rebirth. Now, if that isn't possible, there is still the possibility of a good rebirth as a human being, for example, in consequence of perhaps someone assisting one at the time of death, reciting the names of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and that in conjunction with the dying person being a person having engaged in good deeds throughout his life. The combination of the two may result in a good rebirth. So there are a number of, one wouldn't say options because it's nothing you can choose, which of these possibilities come to be depends upon the deceased person's efforts during his lifetime.
Lasso, that is channel.
So that's all for today.
Sunam de Atamja Zagbani, Tamne, Ebe, Janam Pomjet, Jagana Jabala Truba, Sigbe, Sole, Lowa, Shore. Yeah.